cancel. Okay, the recording has started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited that you're here. For some of you, it's welcome back, and for some of you, it's welcome. I am Libby Simmons. Let's go to the next slide. And I have no financial relationships to disclose except that I'm employed by the West Virginia Department of Education. All right, let's go to the goals for this session. We have several. Hopefully by the end, you will be able to describe your roles and responsibilities, list the required documentation, navigate the guidance document, and navigate our new teams. All right. Then we have three purposes. So we have a lot to accomplish in a short amount of time. We're trying to make the best use of your time. So I'm going to move rather quickly. That's not like our typical SLPA and supervising SLP meetings. But just bear in mind that most of what I present is in the guidance document. I've referenced the pages for you. So, you know, if you have questions, don't feel like you have to take notes, just note the pages. So we want to start the year out with a review for those of you who've been here before, or an overview for those of you who are new. Some of this stuff will be gone over again and again at different meetings, so don't feel like you have to know everything right now. Mainly know where the guidance document is. You can use today's date to count as your meeting your review of your supervision modules that you have to indicate a date on your supervision plan. This is in lieu of that. So we're trying to save you some time there. This is also a stakeholders meeting because we have made some changes to the guidance document. We want to review those with you and we want your feedback. So you are a stakeholder since you are the ones who do this day to day. So let's go to the next thing and let's just talk about the real advantages of this relationship. There was a survey that was done by Ostrigen and Aguilar, and it's 215B because they have two different articles that they did. And they asked the supervisors what the benefits were for them. What were the advantages? And the supervisors said the real benefit of working with an SLPA was working as a team, keeping everybody continually learning. I mean, we're learning from each other. You know, some of you are just out of school, so us, the SLPs who've been out for a while, have a lot you can learn, and we have a lot we can teach. Sharing ideas for therapy. I see that Alicia is on here, and I want to put a plug in for her. She did a presentation at Wild and Wonderful, West Virginia during the forum as an SLPA. She did a wonderful job and she had some great ideas for reinforcers. So sharing those ideas and creative problem solving, because we know we have issues. We have kids sometimes that are a little challenging, and working together, we can do a lot more. So on the next slide, it's a reciprocal relationship. You're a team, it's mutual, it's a two-way street, and just remember that. But the main thing I hope that you remember is that the primary focus needs to be the provision of quality services to the students. As I know, some of you have been working together for years. It's kind of awkward, you know, having that supervisor assistant relationship, but yet if we focus on the quality of services and how we can best serve those students, then I think that takes away that personal issue and you're focusing on the student. So on the next slide, we have some thoughts. Now, I'm not saying do these things, but I would like to ask you or challenge you to work smarter together. Try to think outside the box. Now, we know there's certain things you have to do. You have to follow IEPs. You have to follow your county guidance. However, look at your caseloads. Figure out the best way that you can work smarter. Perhaps you can go to the same schools and do things at the same time in different places. Like the SLP could be doing the assessments or the evaluations, and the SLPA might be providing services in a classroom. Just think outside the box. You might be able to do things a little differently, and especially if you involve your special ed director, you might be able to come up with some great ideas to make the best use of your skills. So we have a new thing. Drum roll, yay! We have a new team. Let's go to the next slide. We have in our teams, we've decided, because we if you go one more, Miss Leanne. So we'll highlight there you go. Big announcement. No class notebook. For those of you who were here last year, and that was the thing that just drove us all crazy, there will not be a class notebook this year. But in order to accommodate that and to help us keep track of all the documentation, we are going to have a different team each year. So it will be designated by years. So if you were in last year's SLPA team, you're going to be a new member of another team. So please just look for a link to this team or when you've been added as a member. And if you don't see that by, let's say, Monday or Tuesday of next week, contact me and I'll make sure that I get you on there. The way we're going to share that documentation is you're going to each have a shared file. And that's going to be shared by Leanne, myself, the SLPA, and the supervisor. So the documentation will be shared that way, but you will also still do assignments, SLPAs, because it's a great way for us to look at something all together and figure out where we are and who's turned in stuff and who hasn't. So if we go to the next page, we're going to review the guidance document since this is the stakeholders' input, and we need your input, and there will be an opportunity in the survey. And I'm going to summarize the information, but you'll notice that I have the pages at the bottom right corner. So if I go fast, and I will, just realize that all of this, 90% of this, is in the guidance document. All right. So the first few pages are basically the same. There's an introduction, assurances, your ethical considerations, and then there's some information there about temporary authorization. And this gets confusing. Temporary authorization is not your licensure. It's with the licensing board. This is through the certification department of the Department of Education. It's very different. It's renewed yearly. And if you were an SLPA last year, Leanne looks at the verification report and the documentation from last year to approve your reauthorization for this year. So make sure that you look at that in the guidance document, and you can see the pages where you can see more information about temporary authorization. Okay, so what are the responsibilities of the speech-language pathologist? First of all, we have responsibilities to the families and students. The SLP, or the supervisor, retains the legal and ethical responsibility for all the students served, not just the ones on the SLP's caseload, but also on the SLPA's caseload. So if you're responsible, then you need to be the main person communicating with the students and their families, and you need to let them know how this arrangement works. Just like you would let them know frequency and duration of services, you need to let them know about the supervision process. Also, you, the supervisor, represent the speech-language pathology team in your IEP meetings, your interagency meetings, and your correspondence, because you are still the responsible party. Yes, the supervisor makes all the clinical decisions, determining who's on the caseload and who's being dismissed. So what is your responsibility to the assistant? You need to provide a good orientation to the SLPA of everybody on the caseload, review the IEP goals, try to look and talk about things that maybe the SLPA has not had experience with or training in, and help define that training and coordinate that training. And then you delegate the tasks. So you still, remember, are the responsible one. Okay. And of course, you, the supervisor, need to document the supervision that you do. We know that if you don't document it, it never really happened. And then this is key, and this is providing feedback to the SLPA. This is not to evaluate the SLPA, but if our focus is the quality of services, then we need to talk about ways that we could all improve. And so in your guidance document, there is a form called the Level of Supervision and Instruction Form, and it basically outlines all of the roles and the responsibilities of the SLPA. And then you together could even document their independence level on those tasks. And then that helps you focus on the areas that you need to to work on a little bit more, or to work together on a little bit more. That will also help you maybe do some of your observations or your release of the SLPA for independence in stages. You might identify that, yeah, speech sound disorders, that's a piece of cake. I don't need to supervise those students as much as I do maybe this kid with a complex communication need. So this kind of helps you focus the areas that you all need to collaborate on more. And thank you, SLPs. Applause for everybody, because we are so grateful for you. We're grateful for the services that you provide to your students and for supervising the SLPA. We know that takes extra time. And, we hope that you're doing it because you really like supervising. So thank you so much. Now we're going to go to the SLPA's responsibilities. And what you do, and what we're so appreciative that you do, is that you can do the speech language screenings without interpretation, as long as you all have gone over it and you agree on what's right and what's wrong, or correct or incorrect. You provide the direct therapy to the students, which is wonderful. You follow those goals and objectives. You assist in evaluations or assessments as needed. And you, of course, assist in the implementation of assistive technology devices. So also, this is the biggie, and these are the things that we get lots of questions about. You prepare a draft IEP under the direction and final approval of the supervising SLP. So you can draft it because you're the one who knows the student the most, but then the SLP needs to review it. Same thing with the progress reports. You're the one that's doing the daily documentation, and you're the most in tune to their progress. But the supervisor needs to provide the final approval. You do the targeted case management if that's something that you've done. And you also submit the daily progress notes for the Medicaid cost settlement. You can't bill for those services, but yet that helps with the cost settlement. So you still submit those progress notes. And that's something that the supervisors should want to review, because that's how they can keep up with the students that you serve. And then you're documenting progress, you're doing, you're establishing working at those established goals, you're tallying the notes, you're doing the scheduling, with the supervisor, and you're performing the checks and the maintenance of equipment. What is your responsibility to the SLP? This is big. I think this is critical, and I think you need to give yourself permission to do this. You ask questions, sometimes if everybody just has small talk and they just kind of go through the process of peeking in and observing, there's not discussions about those students that you're having issues with, or questions that you have about, well, why are you doing that on the IEP? I don't understand. It seems to me that it would be better to work on this first, or he seems to respond better this way. Ask questions. It's okay. Ask the SLP to model a technique or a strategy. Everybody assumes that if nobody says anything, it's all okay. And we know what assuming does to us. So there is a feedback to an SLP form that you should, I encourage you to use, because you, the assistant, can tell your supervisor, what you need help on, and how you best learn. Some people want you to model, to show me. Some people want to read about it. Some people want written notes. So this is your chance to tell your supervisor how you best work and how you learn best. Because remember, our focus is the quality of the services that are provided to the student. You might ask your supervisor to suggest strategies for challenging behaviors, because they may not see that, but because they're not seeing all your students all the time. And notify the SLP of your changes in the student's performance, because sometimes something happens, something happens at home, or they get tired of something, or something's happened in their life, and so you need to notify the SLP of those things as well. Keep them informed. That's your job. That's your role as the assistant. And I am so excited that there is an ASHA certification now for SLPAs. It's about time that they get recognized for what they do. And we're so thankful for them. There's two ways you can go. We began looking at that last year, and we're going to look at it more this year. You can go directly through ASHA, and for some of you who are more experienced, this may be the route to go. Or you can also go through Marshall. And what Marshall does is they provide the 100 hours of ASHA of supervision by an ASHA certified SLP, because that's pretty key. Those of you who are experienced have some supervision, but because this is an ASHA certification, it has to be someone who's ASHA certified. So that might be an issue with you. I think Marshall's great for someone who's just finished their undergraduate program and they're like, I'm not ready to do a master's yet. I just want to be a certified SLPA, or I want to always be a certified SLPA. That could get you through it quicker. They take you through the process, but ASHA has some modules that they provide that you have to see and a test that you need to take. So more to come, but supervisors, just know that this is a wonderful route for your assistance. And thank you, SLP. Hey, we are so grateful for what you do, and we don't thank you enough for what you do. One of the most favorite things of my job was really coordinating the SLPAs last year, because they're so eager and they're so, wanting to learn and, liked having a place where they could communicate with other SLPAs. So I have really, really enjoyed that. And I thank you, Leanne, for letting me do it. Okay, so, I hate to talk about the things that you can't do, but the things that are not in your scope of practice as an SLPA is to represent yourself as a speech-language pathologist, perform those standardized or non-standardized diagnostic tests, participate in conferences without the SLP or without their designating that, independently write or modify the student's IEP. For example, you might be going along and you're like, I think we should be working on this skill instead. And so you just kind of think, well, I'll just start doing that. Well, remember, it's a two-way street, and you need to communicate to the SLP your suggestions. Your suggestions are going to be wonderful, but it needs to be communicated. And then on the next one, you have, you would not sign the formal documents probably at all, but in rare cases, the SLP may designate that for you to do. You don't select the students or dismiss the students or disclose confidential information unless, the supervisor has suggested that be done. And you don't make referrals for additional services. So you, being the one who's at the school all the time, may be the one that the teachers and the families approach, and they want more information, or they want to talk to you about their child or their student, and you want to make sure that you run all this past your supervisor. Treating medically fragile students independently doesn't make sense anyway, but that's certainly listed in your guidance document. And you certainly would be maybe programming for programming the devices, but the design and the selection of the AAC device would be the SLP's decision, and then you guys work together on the programming. Okay, so remember, the supervisor, I see a question from JC. I will try to answer that, JC, in just a little bit. Is it okay for the SLPAs to sign documents if the SLP also signs? Absolutely, you want to do that. I think that's a great idea. Thank you, JC, for sharing that. I have trouble multitasking and reading the questions too. Jennifer wants to know, is there any any documentation for approving the draft? We're going to talk about that. So remember, though, the ultimate responsibility is with the SLP. You retain the full legal and ethical responsibility. Just because a caseload is assigned to the SLPA doesn't mean that the supervisor is not responsible. The assignment is basically a paper thing, but really all these kids are on your caseload as a supervisor. Okay, so then we're going to go through the paperwork rather quickly. And you're like, oh, well, that's the focus. No, the paperwork is for a reason. And if we have you do something, it's because we've looked at what ASHA recommends and we've talked to the SLPAs and supervisors, and this makes a lot of sense. So everything we ask you to do has a purpose. And I'm going to share the purpose before we talk about the paperwork. So if you ever want to know anything about any of the forms, you can go to these pages. In your guidance document, it lists all the forms and which ones are required and which ones are not, and who gets it and how it's done. So this is a good reference for you to get an overview of all the forms. The first form we're going to talk about is the supervision plan, and that's what you guys are doing right now. And it's an important plan because it talks about what you're going to do, how you're going to set up your schedule for the whole year. So that's on pages 18 through 20. And if we go to the next slide, then we're going to say remember that the supervision plan is due 15 days after the beginning of the SLPA's employment. So you have 2 weeks, but you have in 15 days, but that's when it is due. So let's talk about the plan. What's in the plan? First of all, last year we started a new form because we found more information we thought was important. So this year, make sure you use the new form. Last year, we kind of let people slide who used the old form. But this year, the new one is 2 pages instead of 1. And make sure you complete all sections. I know you're like, well, really? But you know, it's when you're in a hurry, when you have a lot to do, you might miss things, and every question is there for a reason. On that plan, you need to put the date that the modules were reviewed. Since you are in attendance here today, you can put today's date, and you don't have to do the PowerPoints that are on your teams. You start out with the caseload assignments that you have right now, knowing that it's going to change. But what is it? And what are your planned percentages of supervision? And we're going to talk about how much you need to supervise. And there's on the second page information about the SLPA, the schools they are assigned to, contact information. And finally, there's an agreement to provide the supervision that the supervisor needs to make sure that they sign, because you're basically signing ethically, legally, I'm going to take responsibility for this SLPA. Okay, on the next page, designing the plan. It makes a lot of sense that you two, your supervisor and the SLPA work together, but really the special ed director needs to be involved too, especially if you're thinking outside the box and maybe looking at the caseloads a little differently. But the special ed director needs to know the amount of time that you need to do this supervision the way that it's supposed to be done. So the supervision is not based on the time you have in your schedule. It's based on what the SLPA needs, their skills, their experience, the needs of the students they serve, the service setting. Some schools are a lot easier than others, not easier, but you can see more students and it takes a little less time if most of your caseload is speech sound disorders. But if you have a school with lots of, complex communication needs or kids who are on the spectrum, then that's very different. We know that. So you need to factor all these things in when you look at your direct and indirect supervision. So as I mentioned, the special ed director needs to be involved because ideally, and I know you're going to be going, oh my gosh, in the real world, it doesn't work that way. But ideally, as your supervisor responsibilities increase, so should your caseload. And I think the only way that you're going to be able to ever get that changed or recognized is if you actually put that on your schedule. This is my direct supervision time. This is my indirect supervision time. And share that information. And over time, people understand that it takes time to work together and to collaborate. So on the next one, what is direct supervision? That is in view, observation, and guidance by the supervisor. So you can observe a portion of a screening, a portion of a treatment, coaching the SLP as they're going through the process, working with a student, and viewing live real-time electronic supervision so that you can provide immediate feedback or even suggestions during the session. Now, we got questions last year because we had supervisors and SLPAs who worked in the same room, and they wondered if they could do the supervision while they were working with different students. Well, if you think about it, if you're focusing on your students and their therapy, it's kind of hard to focus on what the SLPA is doing. I mean, there is a presence in the room, but it's not really supervision. So one of the suggestions I had is that maybe you stagger your schedules a little bit so that maybe your session as a supervisor ends a little earlier, so you have 10 minutes and you could observe that SLPA at their final part of their session. You can be creative about it, but just because you're in the same room doesn't mean that you're directly supervising the student or the SLPA. So what is indirect supervision? And that is, if we look at the next slide, that's where you're doing your record review, you review the IEPs and the progress notes, you review videotaped sessions, and of course your conferences. And we learned last year that you can do conferences in many ways. While we didn't like teletherapy so much in virtual sessions, it told us that we could work together face-to-face virtually, and that should make life a little bit easier. And then feedback after a session would be indirect supervision. Okay, so what are the requirements? For the first 90 days, especially for the first 90 days, at least 30% of the time is supervised. This includes 20% direct and 10% indirect. The 20% direct is based on your actual student contact time. So your schedule, your student contact, 20% of the student schedule that you have. And then the 10% is based on the work week, the total number of hours that you're paid. So it's usually about 35 hours minus your lunch. So let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So for example, if you're looking at 20% of the direct student contact, give or take, it might be 7 hours based on how much back-to-back therapy the SLPA has. And the indirect supervision might be as much as, well, if you're working a 35-hour work week, it would be about 3 hours. So that's a lot. I mean, I don't think we realize what that translates into when we're talking about direct and indirect supervision. So that's the first 90 days. Then if we go to the next slide, if you have, and this is the thing that makes me sick to my stomach, because ASHA recommends, that's in the red, 100 hours of supervision to start out. We did it with the 90 days, but it makes sense, especially if you have a new SLPA who's just come from undergraduate school. The way that the schools work now, they don't get as much experience as in doing therapy until they get into their master's program. And so you may have an SLPA who has no or little experience except observing and working in therapy. And so it makes sense. ASHA is wise in their 100 hours of supervision, but we know realistically that's pretty hard to do. However, I'm encouraging you to think outside the box. Perhaps you can, if your county uses 3 to 1, your first indirect week would be your actual supervision of all the students on that SLPA's caseload. Think about this. Think about what you're asking these people to do who may not have seen all the therapy techniques yet, and they need more of you right off the bat. I'm not trying to put guilt on you, but I'm also asking us to be real about what the SLPA might need right off the bat. So if we go to the next slide, after the 90 days, then you can reduce the direct supervision time to 10%, and the indirect always stays 10%. And so, but if you go to the next slide, this is going to be based on the supervisor. and what they've seen as far as the independence level of the SLPA and how comfortable the SLPA feels doing this therapy by themselves. So it's not just automatically, I need to put more time in my schedule, so I'm going to reduce it because it's been 90 days. So just remember that it's based on the therapist's discretion. So on the next, we've got to change. And drum roll, please. Here we go. Let's go to the next slide. For experienced SLPAs, now, what does experienced SLPA mean? Not maybe even someone who's had a year or two, but we have some SLPAs who've been working for 5, 10, 15 years as an SLPA. They are definitely experienced. So ASHA had recommended that after the 100 hours, which we wish we could, do exactly as they say, that you could reduce it to 1 hour a week. So how do you determine the experience? First of all, reminder, the caseload is still the responsibility of the supervising SLP, and it's their discretion and their decision about making this change. So on the next slide, it has to be based on the SLPA's familiarity with the caseload. If they've been in the same school, seeing the same kids for 5 years, and there's not a lot of change, then that makes sense. And I highly recommend that you use this level of supervision and instruction form to really objectively, look at the SLPA's independence in the areas that basically are represented on their caseload. But remember, the 10% indirect always remains the same. ASHA recommends it too. You're going to be responsible for those things or for those students, and so you need to be aware of what's going on. So if the caseload has new students, let's say the caseload has changed, then the supervising SLP should supervise 20% until they feel comfortable with the SLPA's treatment of those new students. Now, let's say these are new students, but it's the same problem. The R, they have 3 more R students added. They're new students, but they have lots of experience with R. But we also know that R is different with every student. So you want to make sure that they're comfortable and they're on the right path before you go back to that 1 hour. In the event of a new supervisor assistant relationship, you start over. The reason that I'm saying that is it takes time to get on the same page. You may think differently. You may have different opinions of, how you've been doing things and how your supervisor or SLPA wants to do things. And to establish a team, which we've talked about, the reciprocal relationship, it has to be, you have to start out and take some time. So you go back to the 20% if there's a new supervisor SLPA relationship. Okay, so on the next slide, if we can go to the next slide. So, whoops. Okay, so the absence of the supervising SLP, this is also in your guidance document. If the SLP is absent for an extended period of time, maternity leave, illness, then you need to find a new supervisor and you do another supervision plan. That's also in your guidance document. The medically fragile, I just don't think it's a good idea. I could see where in a hospital setting, you might have 2 medically fragile patients in the same room where you're working at the same time and you're right there. But otherwise, it just makes more sense that the supervisor do those students if they're going to have to be there to do the observations. And then finally, on the next slide, we have teletherapy. Oh, we got to have some fun with teletherapy last year. And hopefully we won't be facing that so much this year. But on page 12, you can see that if you do have to go to teletherapy, then the 100% of the time for the first session with every student on the SLPA's caseload should be observed, and then 25% thereafter. And so you would change that documentation on the form we're going to talk about later. The whole point of that is it's different. It's a learning experience. It's not to add more work to you as a supervisor, but it's you know, there's a lot of adjustments you need to make. You guys know that. And so that's the purpose of this, this rule. Okay, and ASHA recommends, always in red, I put what ASHA recommends, that we supervise no more than 2 SLPAs at a time. We realize that some counties need to supervise more because there's such a shortage. So at this time, you can supervise 3 SLPAs, but that may change, so just be aware of that. It's just not the best practice to do that many, because if you add those hours up, I mean, that's like 21, 22 hours a week of just supervision. And then if you have a caseload, then that's even more. So on the next slide, we have just a reminder, and if you want to hit it again, there's your reminder that we have 10% of the indirect supervision always remains the same, no matter what. So just remember that, you know, you're just going to need to plan, you know, on at least 3 hours. Now that can be reviewing the IEPs, reviewing the data, but it's going to take time to do that. But ultimately, because you're responsible, you need to keep track of what's going on. Okay, so on the next slide, we're going to talk about the documentation of supervision. And if you go to the next slide, we have what ASHA says. They said that documentation of all supervisory activities need to be accurately recorded. We agree with that. And we developed a form, if you want to go to the next slide, that would enable you to document those things. Just remember that whether you use the form that I'm going to show you or you develop your own form, the things that we think that need to be documented somehow. You might make an Excel spreadsheet that has the same information. This is not turned into us, but it's how you document the direct and indirect supervision. And it needs to be maintained somewhere. You know, you all decide in your county how you're going to maintain that documentation. So if we go to the next slide, you have what we came up with. That doesn't mean you have to use that, but as I said, we want to make sure that you keep track of these certain things. You can see that we have the 5 days of the week, and we have a direct section and an indirect section where you would just block out, you know, the time that you spent and what you did. If you go to the next slide, you can see that I've just given you an example. And of course, you don't need to type it in. I typed it because you couldn't read my writing. But, you know, you need to be a little more specific than just saying indirect or direct supervision. Who did you supervise? That's going to help you remember that you've seen all these students every so often, and we're going to talk about that next. And then, you know, what did you do? So that you can go back and say, yeah, we talked about this at that time. And yeah, we talked about having an IEP meeting, and it's just keeping everybody on the same page. We also have figured out, given you a way to calculate the percentages, because I know none of us, most of us as speech pathologists are not good at math. And so at the bottom, it kind of takes you through how you calculate those percentages. As I said, though, the issue is just that you have this documentation, however you decide to work that out. But it's done weekly, and it changes weekly. Okay, this is the DUSA form, the direct observation of students assigned to the SLPA. You can find information on that on pages 25 and 26. We call it DUSA, for lack of a better name, because that's a long thing to say. So if you look at the next slide, you can see that ASHA recommends that at least every 60 days that the supervisor see everybody on the SLPA's caseload. So yes, Sarah, I agree. eSchool Docs will help you with the documentation of the weekly supervision. But anyway, ASHA recommends, and it makes sense, if you're going to be responsible for these, every student on the SLPA's caseload, it makes sense that you have to see those students every so often. So ASHA recommends every 60 days, but we're going with your 9 weeks reporting period. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see that we have the DUSA form. And I have highlighted dates because that's something that a lot of people will just put checks that they did those things. But the point is for you to have dates so that you can remember and you can document that you actually did it. So on that form, you put the student's initials because it's going to be turned in to us. So for confidentiality, the initials and the grade, and then you put your comments to help you remember things like a new IEP or the student moved or they were dismissed or whatever, just to kind of help you remember, why you didn't see the student that month or that 9 weeks. Maybe they were out of school, they were in the hospital. And then you can see this is divided into 4 9-week periods. So for every 9 weeks, you need to directly observe the students, all the students who are listed on the SLPA's caseload. And then the PR stands for progress report. Remember, we talked about, the SLP needs to review all the progress reports and that the SLPA has written. Well, this is where you say, yep, I reviewed it and I reviewed it on this date and it's okay. So you would fill that out. If you want to go to the next slide, you'd fill that out for every 9 weeks. And by the end of the year, you would have all 4 9 weeks completed. Now, some of you, we went through this last year. Sometimes it's hard to put all this information because there's so many changes and so forth on one page. So you might just do one form for every 9 weeks, and then at the end of the year, you put it all together on one form to turn in with a verification report. But we think this is important enough that it be part of your verification, because if you're responsible as a supervisor for that caseload, you need to see those students every once in a while. And we according and very similar to ASHA, think that every 9 weeks grading period would be a good time while you're reviewing the progress reports anyway to make sure that everybody's on the same page and that the quality of services are continuing. So then if you go, just make sure that you list all the students with the initials. You see those 4 9-week periods. Remember that you put the dates, not check marks, not an arrow down that I did all that on the same day. That just is, not as accurate of documentation. All right, new change. Here's the change. Drum roll. We have changed the responsibility for filling out that DUSA form to the SLP, and that makes sense. If you're the one who's trying to coordinate and see all these students, then you should be the one filling out that form. It just makes sense because you're the one who needs to be keeping track of these things. So we're going to have that shared OneDrive that the SLP would submit that documentation to each 9 weeks, and then at the end with a verification report. But the SLP will also have that documentation and will submit it in assignments. And we'll talk about that in a minute. All right. So remember that supervision is much more than just watching. and we've provided several suggested forms for you to use to kind of provide feedback. We've talked about most of these. But also we need to be evaluating ourselves, and the SLPA might need to look at themselves, and that is good information for talking about training that's needed and, assistance that's needed from the supervisor. So check those forms out. We value those and hope you use them. Okay, so the verification report, you're like, okay, that's due June 1st. Let's go to the next slide. And you're like, why are we talking about that now? And that is because we need to begin with the end in mind. So if we click, there you go, because we need to think about that. At the end of the year, when it's all crazy and you don't have all this information that you need, you will be glad that we worked toward that end and thought began with the end in mind. So the verification report on the next slide is the next is due June 1st. And the verification report is probably the most important thing that you do, because this is what Leanne looks at to determine whether the SLPA is reauthorized for the next year. So there's the verification report, which is only one page, the DUSA form, which is, for all 49 weeks, and verification of attendance. All certificates of attendance must be included. Let's go to the next page and we'll talk about that a little more specifically. So here's the verification report, the first part. I know you're like, well, of course, why do we need to go over these little pieces of the verification report? And it's because often, people forget, they're in a hurry, and they don't fill out everything. And so just a reminder, you need your number on the SLPA caseload. That may have changed, would be added. And then we go to the next slide, and that's your direct observation, your direct supervision time. What percentage did you end up supervising the SLPA? And then we go to the indirect, and you fill in the next slide. There you go. And so what percentage of time did you indirectly supervise? And then if you go to the next slide, just to point out that the weekly direct, indirect supervision logs, that's whether you do it on eDocs or on a spreadsheet or whatever, but you have it available. You're verifying that you have that available. And then if you go to, whoops, not quite yet. If the professional development, that's a big piece. SLPAs are required to have 12 hours of professional development. And you're going to list that on this form. And remember that the 12 hours need to be in communication disorders. They need to be very specific to communication, not safety or county trainings that you have to go through. It needs to be related to the communication disorders. On the next slide, we list what could be approved. Attendance at a state or national conference. Make sure you have a certificate of attendance. Professional development activities that are designated by the department. We offer lots of these, like today, you'll get a certificate. This can go toward your 12 hours. Or something that your county does. Make sure when the county does those, first of all, that they run them past Leanne, that they're approved. And then at the time of the training, make sure you as an SLPA, you get either a certificate from your lead therapist, or you get a copy of the login where you've signed that you were there, something documenting that you attended. Because last year we had people right at the very end, contacting their leads, trying to get certificates. And if you do it all along, it's not going to be a big deal. But that's really important that it is documented. Now, we did add for the students who are full-time, a full-time graduate program, and we have several of those now. Welcome, guys. And you're working full-time as an SLPA, you can count one of your 3-hour graduate classes. But on the next slide, you can see for just regular hours that are for an upgrade, a pay upgrade or certificate renewal, we don't count those. Or your clinical externships or your practicums, that wouldn't count. And the reason being, I think professional learning should be broad and varied, and we should make sure that, we see different kinds of things. And so that's why it's in essence double dipping if you take a class for a pay upgrade and you also count it as your 12 hours. We offer so many that I think it is going to be easy for you to get the 12 hours without, really paying for anything, and yet getting some good information. So if we get in the next slide, then you can see the copies of the certificates of attendance are included. Make sure you include those. It can be listed. So for everything you've listed there as your professional development, you need a certificate of attendance or some way of verifying that you attended those things. I know some counties offer speechpathology.com as a a plus for being an employee with the county. So you could use those certificates as well. Okay, so then we want to have signatures by everybody on that's been involved with the supervision. We start with the supervising SLP, and then we go to the next one, which is the SLPA, and then we go to the next one, which is the special ed director. So many, I mean, we had 2 or 3 this year that, came back with the special ed director's signature, and they're part of this. They need to know what's going on. And I know it's crazy at the end of the year and it's hard to reach them or whatever, but, plan, knowing in advance, beginning with the end in mind, that you're going to need that signature and to go over that. And then on the next slide, you can see where we have the direct observations of students assigned to the SLPA. So that form is attached. That's where you've compiled all 4 9 weeks progress report dates and observation dates. And make sure you put the date that everybody signs things as well. Okay, it's due June 1st. And that is the most important document, because that is what is reviewed by Leanne for her to authorize your renewal for the next year. So if you go to the next slide, you can see, just as a reminder, there's 3 things you turn in: the verification report, which is 1 page, your DUSA form, which has all 4 9 weeks, and your verifications of attendance. And if you start saving those and putting them in your shared drive, it's going to be really easy for you by the end of next year. Okay, and then let's talk about the teams. They've changed it a little bit this year, but this is where we're going to talk about what you do with the documentation. So both of your teams will have, first of all, this is the supervising SLP, but the SLPA team looks like this too. You'll see, first of all, you have places for you to post things. So if we go to the next slide, you also have places for your files. So post, please. I see lots of questions that are happening, and we're not going to get to those, but we will post those. We'll answer those in the teams. That is your team. That's where you post questions and you say, I have this question or I have this issue. What do I do? That's a great place to post. The files, that's where you're going to find these things. If we go to the next slide, it's a little bit bigger. You can see that right now you have forms, and some of those forms are fillable. Now, yay, any of the PowerPoints that we use will be there. The save the dates are there already, and your guidance document is there. And like I said, I'm going through this fast, and I'm sure I see you have lots of questions. Look at the guidance document. Most of this is directly from that guidance document, and there's a lot more information than what I could provide. We'll also have copies of the recordings, and you would find those in the tabs at the top. If you go to the next slide, the SLPA team looks a little different. They've moved the tabs that are related to the class notebook to the side. There is no class notebook, though. You'll see it, but there's not going to be anything in there. Yay, 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 yay. So if you go to the next slide, you'll have your assignments. And on your assignments, you will see, if you click on that on the left, you'll see that there's an assignment already for the supervision plan. In that assignment, there's going to be a description of what you need to do. There's a matrix for you to check and make sure that you've done everything that needs to be done and everything is completed, because that's what is that's what is used. So look at that supervision plan. And Leanne can tell by looking at the grade notebook or the grade book later that everything has been completed by the points that are there. So it's not like it's a grade, but it's telling us that you've filled out everything, that you've turned it in. It's included in both the shared file and in the assignments. So you just look at that matrix and double check it before you turn it in. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that as an SLPA, you have a place at the bottom after you've gone through first of all, you look and you see there's directions, and then there's the supervision plan where you can download it. And then when you're finished, when you guys have filled that out, signed it and whatever, and you get it scanned, and you know, consider how you're going to get it scanned. I'm sure the board office somewhere has a scanner. Then you add your work, which is the bottom left. Lots of times we forget to do that. And we go to turn in, which is the top right, and it doesn't, there's no work. So make sure that you do both of those things, and it will help you keep track of the dates and so forth too, by having these assignments. And then the grades basically will give you your points back that says, yep, I see someone has seen it, and it's checked off, everything is in, and you just have that kind of feedback. That's all that is. It's not really a grade. It's just saying that everything is completed and we've moved on to the next thing. It's the best way for Leanne to be able to look at the big picture and see that everybody's turned in everything, and she doesn't have to go through every shared file to double check. So that's just really helpful to us. So on the next slide, I think we are talking about the shared folder, which I mentioned. You will get a link that is just for you, the SLPA, the supervisor, Leanne, and myself. And you would, as you complete this information, you would go ahead and share it. And your county may require that you share it with the lead SLP as well. And then you want to maintain a copy for yourself. So there's the shared folder. You should get the links next week. And somehow I'm done, and I know there's lots of questions. I get this. And I'm sorry, but we wanted to make the best use of this time. I'm going to put the link to the survey in here, and there's several things in here. It's asking you, are you willing to be a stakeholder and be listed in the guidance document? If not, you can opt out. Also, there's questions about progress reports and when your grading periods are. So please fill this out, look at the guidance document, give us some feedback. We're going to use that as we finish getting it completed and through graphics. And I hear Leanne on here. There must be some questions.
I just wanted to say I've tried to respond to the questions as they've been asked, so I think we're all right. One clarification I did want to make is at the beginning, Libby talked about Board of Examiners licensure for SLPAs, and that is not required by the Department of Education. Only the certification for the SLPA authorization is required. You are more than welcome to choose to do that for yourself professionally, but it is not required. I just didn't want there to be any confusion about that. And I did drop the link for the attendance in the chat.
I see that. Great. Thank you. I should have made that more clear. Yeah, because there has been some confusion about that this year. Make sure you complete the verification of attendance. You have till Monday. You know, consider looking at the guidance document and making any suggestions that you have. This is your chance to give us some feedback. So thank you. Welcome. We're going to go over all these things monthly, and there's going to be more times for questions, and it's going to be more informal. Just wanted to make the best use of your time and do all three things in one meeting. So thank you so much.
Okay, Libby, you do have one question, so go ahead and do that one real quickly if you don't mind.
The 9-week calendar portion of the verification of the attendance mean. The 9-week count. That's what I'm needing from you guys, Julia, is every county starts at a different time, and so their 9 weeks starts at a different time. And so I'm just getting dates from you guys so that when I put the deadline for the DUSA form, it's within your range. So I'm just trying to get feedback from you guys, because it's hard to look through every county's calendar to see when your 9 weeks periods end and begin. Thanks for asking the question. Thank you, Charla. Good to see you guys again. I'm sorry I could not see, I could not do both. I could not talk and read your your questions, but it sounds like Leanne handled them. Thank you so much. Good luck. You know you can reach us anytime.